I'm joined today with Craig Davidson. Craig Davidson is, if you're watching this, you probably already know who he is. He's lots of things. He's a husband, a father, lives in Canada, teaches, but of course, most people who know his name are aware of his writing. So you've written a lot of books. You've written a lot of literary fiction, a lot of and nonfiction under your real name, Craig Davidson. I got a lot of those here. Got Star Night Ghost Club, which is well known. Sarah Court,
Somewhat less known.
Cascade. What's that?
Somewhat less known, but I'm
Yeah,
glad.
somewhat less known, but yeah, man,
I'm
it's
glad you got a copy.
no, they're all special. And then Cascade, that's your most recent under Craig Davidson, right? Yeah. The Fighter, this is your premiere novel, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, The Fighter.
Yeah.
This one is as scary as anything you've years out to, and I mean that obviously in a good way. I mean,
Sure.
it's so gripping and riveting, and yeah, it really grabbed you. Cataract City is similarly, I'd say the same about this as I've said about some of your horror, is that the dog race scene is one of the most gut-wrenching scenes I've ever read. It's on par with any gut-wrenching scene I've read in your horror. So, but I mean, outside of that, I mean, it's just such an incredible story. So, so folks who are here because you like his horror, make sure you check out these. These are special. And then Rust and Bone, kind of a collection of your.
Yeah.
I think you have more than this.
You have most. That's most of it, though. I feel like, yeah, the nonfiction, the Precious Cargo.
Precious Cargo. That's the one I listened to on audio.
The only one you don't have, at least to my own.
Yeah, no, that's the one I listened to that one on audio. Yeah, Precious Cargo. And then you've written also as well under another pen name, Patrick Lustuka, which to my great sorrow, those are harder to track down.
Well, you might have saved yourself a lot of sorrow and wasted effort on that level. Not that, I mean, I'm sure you've spoken to plenty of writers, and we all have. I mean, those were written right at the very beginning of my my path to becoming a writer. So, it's not that I'm not proud of them. But they definitely spring from a different place and time in my life, and I think I was pursuing different agendas. So, Paul, if you never find them, if you don't become that level of a completist, I think you're probably
all right.
You'll be all right.
Well, if I stumble across it, I'll pick it up. But then, of course, what so many of you know Craig for is his work under Nick Cutter. So The Troop, first novel under Cutter, and then I think next after that was The Acolyte. Is that right?
I think you're probably right, or it was either The Deep or The Acolyte. Those two were the next two in some order, and
yeah,
then,
that's right.
And then Little Heaven.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, The Deep, well known as well. And then Little Heaven, which actually, just so you know, this is my favorite.
You've done. I can see you've got. I like the sticky notes on it. That's.
That was product of some deep reading. And then actually, I just found out about this one really recently. It's a short story in this collection, Dark Cities.
Oh, geez. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's Christopher Golden's collection or an anthology. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's right. Christopher Golden. So I just, The Crack is the name of that story, which, man, we'll get into this a little bit. I'm a father of two, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so features of your stories have hit me pretty roughly in different parts.
Yeah.
But the whole sleep training component of The Crack was, I mean, I know it's sort of like an incidental component of it, but you're like, oh man, you relive those days of the baby not sleeping.
It's a form of madness. It's a form of torture.
Yeah, that's right. So one reason I wanted to talk and is because I being just sort of fascinated by your work, I sought out a bunch of interviews and they were awesome. I loved listening to them. One that was great. It's on that podcast, This Is Horror, episodes 217 and 18 for those who want to go track that down. And lots of others like it where they asked really great questions about your writing craft and about things like that, which I was really grateful to learn. what I also really wanted to know, that I would have loved, I just wanted to hear you talk about your own stories and about horror itself. And so that was kind of the impetus behind reaching out to hear from you. So that's going to be what I'm going to focus on.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, I think I think I remember the interview you're talking about, and the two British guys, right? Or maybe I think, yeah. And
and it's about 2 hours. I mean, a little 2 hours of
yeah. And I remember enjoying it, and I remember I wouldn't say it was boilerplate at all. I don't mean that. I think a lot of interviewers, though, you sort of that is, I think what they asked, or what I assume a lot of listeners want to talk about.
Sure.
And maybe not. Maybe I sort of went afield, but you're right. Over the last couple of years, I'm not. I don't do as many interviews. I'm not quite sure why. I suppose it's sort of like maybe COVID has had something to do with it. It's like I don't feel like I have a lot of more nuanced things to say. We'll find that out. Here is a here is a test and practice of whether I actually do have anything more nuanced or more to say. But at a certain point, you have answered these questions. And I'm not sure what you're going to ask, but
Sure.
I think even sometimes you notice even the most sort of what would seem like the most outre questions, ultimately you can kind of back funnel into an answer you've already given before, and I think when I reached that point, I thought, well, if I'm just going to sort of be restating things that I've said either in print or on a podcast at some other point, then really there's probably no use for. I'm doing the interviewer a disservice at that point too, because I'm not answering an original question in an original way. So, but you did give me some of the terrain that I think you plan to cover today did strike me as actually quite different as some questions I asked. So I'm excited for that.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it. And I should mention, you got a new one coming out with Andrew Sullivan, the Handyman Method.
That's right. Yeah. We, have been a long gestating project. So yeah, if you'd like to talk about that, that's certainly, I haven't spoken about that before. And obviously where Andrew's sitting here, he'd have his own contribution to it, but I certainly won't throw him under the bus or anything.
That's good. I've started his The Waste, and it's, it's very, his writing it exalts you for sure.
Yeah. He's an excellent writer. So we've known each other forever, and it's never natural necessarily to collaborate with someone, but it felt like our aesthetics. I mean, it's weird before you write, because I love Andrew's writing too, and he obviously must enjoy mine, and you think, oh well, this will be like it'll be easy waters to navigate, and then you realize ultimately, like aesthetically and otherwise, there are sort of friction points between any two writers. There's also a matter of like who is going to steer the ship necessarily, because at some point, you can either like genteelly fight over the wheel, or someone can just say, okay, all respect, I think in this chapter I need to sort of go this way. So that's something that I've not had to do before, and I know Andrew hasn't had either. So that was a little bit of I wouldn't even say rough waters. It's just a different thing that we had to navigate.
Because you're kind of the captain of the ship when you're writing your own story, and that's tough. I'm co-writing an article right now, and it hasn't become an issue yet. We've only been kind of doing the note-taking phase and drafting. But I'm sure it's on the horizon, because I know we have different writing styles, and ultimately our name's going to be on both of it, and it's going to be like a peer review article. So I want to make sure, and so it's on my horizon as well.
Well, so. Let me know how it goes. I'm sure it went really. I guess the book wouldn't even be coming out if it hadn't have gone well. But you sort of like, you're going for the rocks. It's like to extend the analogy. It's like, well, I don't even see the rocks there. Well, I do. In any case,
that's good. Well, I'm looking forward to it. That's the Handyman Method.
Yep, the Handyman Method. Cool. That's right.
Nice. Out in August, I think. Okay, so I'll jump in then with some basics about horror. What scares you in a movie or a novel? We can pick novels if we're talking about novels. Maybe what is it that actually causes dread for you when you're experiencing one of these things?
What am I? My own phobias, I think. Like anything else, Paul, I think they develop over time. The things that you're scared of as a child, you being a father yourself, me seeing it with my children. I mean, they're very elemental at first, you know, and I think that doesn't necessarily change like fundamentally, but you know, you're scared of the monster in the closet. Or I remember my son, and it must be so terrible to be inarticulate about it and not being able to express that fear. He used to and we turn the light off and he'd point up in the corner, he'd say like the boat. And it was just the boat. He was scared of, or the boats. I don't know, maybe it was even creepier being that it was pluralized. And you know, obviously we would turn the lights on and do the whole thing that a parent does, open up the closet and look around and say there's nothing there. And then, but as soon as you turn the light off, it's once again, it's this thing that's scaring him. And we never really got to the bottom of what the boats was, because he didn't have the language capacity at that point to really express what his issue was. So it's interesting watching your children that way. And it's interesting watching how your own fears sort of change. I know when I was, you know, a kid, I got into Stephen King very early. Clearly he's left a real imprint on me. But like I read Pet Cemetery. You know, when I was a kid, I was scared of maybe the idea of the boy coming back to life, maybe the idea in a weird way, like the wife's sister, Zelda, you know, that was kind of handled in a like the idea of sickness or ill health and the way that you can't fight that. And there were elements of that, but, and obviously the idea of this cryptic thing out in the woods that had these terrible, terrible powers. But when I reread it as an adult, as a father, in fact, well, then like I actually understood Judd's conundrum. You know what I mean? It's like, what wouldn't you do ultimately to try and like reestablish some kind of normalcy or surety in your life and within your family, right? I mean, there's nothing you wouldn't do, sadly. And that's why that book just hits a different register, I guess, depending on where you read it. And it would be the same as books that I read because I liked them as a teenager because they were just so boundary pushing, you know, threshold testing. And then you might read them again and be like, well, I mean, outside of the threshold testing, there might not be quite as much there to sort of cling on to from an adult's perspective, you know. But at the same point, they were riotously kind of galvanic to me when I was that age. I just came across them at the right age for them to do the thing, for them to work that kind of magic. Whereas something like Pet Cemetery, I think works magic at different times in your life. I suppose if I read it again when I'm 80, I might make a different resonance from it. But so for me, like, I mean, there's obviously the fundamental things that I mean, you know, and they're in the books. You know, I don't like congested spaces. You know, I don't like deep water. My wife would tell you, it's true. My biggest fear is actually sharks, but you know, it's like Jaws is the plus ultra of shark books. And even though there's shark movies and shark books that come out seemingly every year, I can't wrap my head around doing one that would do any justice to the, you know, if I can ever come up with an idea that like, oh, wow, you know, I would absolutely try and pursue something about a shark, you know, or sharks. But beyond that, it's like, yeah, it's the things that scare me now are much different. I mean, you're scared of your family coming to peril. You're scared of your parents becoming ill and becoming less, you know, vital and losing them ultimately at some point. And, you know, you're scared of your own sense of like what you maybe thought you were going to do with your life or be, and the ways that, you know, sort of for so many of us, for pretty much every one of us, it never quite works out exactly the way that whatever sort of half-formed, half-baked ideas we have about what we're going to become. So it's like, you know, to say that's horror too, that's so quotidian, right? Is that really horror? Is that what people really would pick up a horror book and read it for? I don't really know. But you know, that those are sort of the things that sometimes I tend to work with, the sort of primal fears, and then more kind of the more elemental, or I think specific fears that I've had as I've gotten older, have to do with the helplessness of being a dad, the helplessness of being a husband sometimes, you know, things like that. I mean, very much like the handyman method, for example. It's very much to do with like, to say this is a fear is not exactly the right thing, but I don't know how you grew up, Paul, like what the dynamics were in your family.
Yeah.
But mine, it was very much like my dad was like, he was a banker, and
Yeah.
whenever the finances and the family kind of hubbed around his job.
Sure.
Where mom was nurse and as capable as my dad, but if we moved, it was like she had to pick up stakes and find something new. And, I asked her while I was writing the book, like, were you upset about that? And she's like, well, I mean, yeah, and I probably should have been more. We all should have been more, but like, you would get up in the morning and all the men in the neighborhood would get in their cars and go off to work, and all the women would later, walk the kids to school. And it was just like, that's just how it was done. So I didn't feel so bad because I felt like I was just a part of the way that society operated at that point. But now obviously it's not that way. I'm around much more often with my child, and my wife sort of has the go to work job, and if our son gets sick, it's me who normally will stay home, or daughter, right? So it's like, and I recognize that is the fair and the right way that it ought to be, but every so often, and again, there's a part of being writing that is being as honest as you can be, I think, with your own shortcomings. And like, I'll get stupidly upset for a moment. It'll just zip through me like a thundercloud of like, what the hell? This is not, what the hell? Like, it's stupid, as it's like, it's, it's better, and it's more equitable, and it's the way it ought to be. But at the same point, you're fighting this sort of inborn prejudice that goes back to when you were a kid. So, that's sort of a fun part of writing, whether horror or not, is to find these kind of, I don't know, things surfing through culture, and it's like trying to catch a greased eel and see if you can catch it and see if you can comment on it in a way that maybe feels somewhat fresh.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, you said, so comparable upbringing. My dad, both worked, but but most, so I'm one of 7 kids. So at the end, I'm the last of 7. So finally my mom just had to stay home. Someone's got to stay with 7 kids, and so my dad was the one who worked and moved, and now we have comparable dynamic, in my family, in my own unit. We both work, and we both try, we're constantly moving around on the schedules. But it speaks to, as you said, man, that's the quotidian aspects of life. Not like that staying home with your kids is a horror or anything like that, but like the quotidian aspects of life that are the things that present some of the most kind of fundamental fears. It was more often than not my time with my kid on, whatever. Speaking of the deep, a playground, or they fall and they get really, really, hurt, and it just or you're in another room and you hear a cry and you think, what is it? What's happening? Is this something I need to be frustrated at because these 2 kids are fighting? Or is this something like, like, did someone just get hurt? And you don't know. And it's these like very quotidian aspects of life that can be horrifying, right? Like you don't really need to reach that far to make an everyday life pretty horrific,
No, I think some of the best writing, we'll do that. We'll take, as you said, like a fairly everyday scenario, because I think that's it too. It's like, I think what some writers want to do, what I sort of try and do if I can, is again, you try and isolate those things that you feel like, this is a feeling, or this is a sentiment that would be readily grasped by not only by the people who actually share that kind of life history, but also would be grasped by people who don't. But it seems common enough that they would be able to sort of follow the thread of the narrative, follow the emotions that are being ascribed to that character, right? And I've sort of said, it's like, you're trying to reach into somebody else's, a stranger's chest, and try and isolate those points of connection between yourself and that hypothetical reader. And when you felt that, I know when I felt that through any piece of art, whether it be a book or a movie or a television show or whatever, there's that very strong resonance, like, I as the kids would say nowadays, I feel seen. I feel like I've made a connection because this person has found something on the human continuum that we both seem to share, and if it's not the exact event, that, that's not uncommon. But if it's within sort of the realm of that feeling, then those are the sort of things that could be good or bad. Sometimes, again, it's, as I said, sometimes getting as squirmy as you can, or getting as honest as you can with your own shortcomings, your own fears, your own failings, and presenting those through the characters to the reader. That kind of vulnerability, I think, I think it's somewhere where I feel I need to go ultimately. I think I've always sort of been that way, because there, I mean, too, as a professor too, I've done higher education as well, and I'm not saying that higher education is a way has a way of taking you away from those kind of more base or kind of emotions, but I feel like sometimes you go through a creative writing class and you come out maybe a little more sterile. Sometimes maybe you're writing, sometimes maybe it should or shouldn't, but it kind of comes out more polished than, and emotionally kind of distant than what you would maybe have gone in with. That's not necessarily just creative writing classes, and I certainly have been in them, and I've taught them, and I think they're like valuable, and I think are necessary, and it's great to have that kind of community and being able to bounce ideas and find like-minded people. But there's a feeling sometimes of being, I think maybe outside of even that, just of scared of approaching these things, because it's like you're showing too much of yourself, or people will ascribe to you the things that you have given to your character. And sometimes it is actually true. It's like, yeah, no, it is right. Like, these things that I'm giving this character, actually, these are things that I feel. And, but that gives the character a little level of power that I wouldn't be able to give them otherwise. It gives them, at least I would hope, a level of believability, maybe. So yeah, I think a lot of what it is for me anyways with writing is being as truthful and as squirmy as I can be, and living with the consequences of that as well. And carefully, making sure my wife sort of reads my books before they come out, so she feels like it's one thing to purloin your own self, what I mean? But it's a different thing to present things that kind of serious, those kind of intimate details.
I got you. Well, that's the deal. I mean, I often, so you mentioned honesty, and that's what I comes across well in both in your Cutter and your Davidson books, particularly like a Cataract City or The Fighter, is that I think there's an honesty about the fact that our lives can be horrific, and expressing it. I think horror has as a genre, provides a unique way to be honest about some of that, because of the kind of acceptable norms of the genre, and it allows you to put some otherwise sort of unmentionables under the microscope, and I think in a really interesting way. So one of the most dread-inducing components to me in your book, both The Deep and Little Heaven, is the notion that the world might not be the way you think it is, right? And that you might discover that the world is not the way you thought it was, right? So in the Troop, it's biological weapon gone wild, but in The Deep and Little Heaven, these are stories that they weave a tale that kind of show you that a common or a modern understanding of the fabric of reality is just not the way that it is, right? So I mean, there's lots of quotes I could read, but one particular that stuck out to me was from page 286. Do you mind if I read it?
Oh, go for it.
Yeah, this is page 286 in your Little Heaven, and this is from Ebbs when he's thinking on the fact of the vision that the creature gave him of the face of God, that sort of thing. And he said, looking back, Ebenezer was unsure that human minds were built to cope with anything of what happened down there. He felt no shame thinking that either. as he did not believe humans were built to come to grips with anything that existed beyond their conventional means of reckoning. When humans experience something that challenges their fundamental belief of the world, its reasonableness, its fixed parameters, well, their minds crimp just a bit. A mind folds, and in that fresh pleat lives a darkness that cannot be explained or accounted for. So they ignore that pleat as best they can. It and the darkness it holds, but it's always there, always seeking redress. It's a great paragraph. What is it about sort of that the realization the world's not the way you thought it was that inspires dread or terror?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's interesting because other people will find sort of continual themes in my or anybody's writing that maybe is not even because there's nothing like writing or creative stuff to highlight a person's obsessions and the way that they keep moving back to the same type of terrain one way or the other, and
readers might notice it more than you do or something.
Well, exactly, because you're sort of, the obsessive is so obsessive that they're not even aware of their obsession, and probably looking it in the face would only frighten them. So you're sort of aware of these sort of cyclical. And the thing is, if they wouldn't be obsessions if you ever solve them, because then ultimately, I guess you would have come to some kind of conclusion or some kind of surety about them, and thus you could just dismiss them and move on to a new obsession.
Yeah.
So, and I can't say that there's anything in my life or anybody that I've been fortunate, knock on wood, to not have anybody close to me deal with a significant sort of mental illness that they would, that I can see firsthand and see how that kind of. So I'm not writing from that perspective in the way that somebody who is, suffering a psychic break would feel like the world is not right and there's no harmony in it. And it's, I think I'm just interested in notions of, and I think as a, it's interesting, Paul, kind of as a fiction writer, especially of the stuff that I write in the Cutter vein, it's not realistic. And one of the things, like, even on this is an interesting thing you brought up, because even on a technical level, unlike, say, Cataract City or The Fighter, or these books that I started with, yes, there might be a few scenes or moments in there where it goes into the phantasmagorical, but it's always anchored in a reality, essentially. You know what I mean? So there's not a sense of having to lead a reader over a certain threshold where it's like easing them into, it's like putting the frog in the boiling water and slowly bringing it. So, you either drop it in, and that's not going to work. You got to put them in warm water and sort of bring it up until they're boiling, and that's kind of, with some of these books, you have to kind of figure out a way textually, emotionally, sort of psychologically, to sort of bring a reader along and brace them for the impact of these kind of downstream leaps of illogicalness. So in some ways, paragraphs like that are fun to write, and in some way, I do think that they are preparing a reader for, what is to come. You know what I mean? And sort of like helping them along, and sort of saying, like, human minds, are prone to fracture. There are things not in the world, but in the world that I am trying to conjure here as a writer, that are going to test the thresholds of whatever reality in which you're reading this book.
Right.
So it's actually, it is interesting to, because that's something that I'll work hard with my editors on, and sort of the first draft of a book. It's I had an editor, this is for the Craig Davidson stuff. It's like, there'd be a scene that she would be like, I know you want to get to this scene. Clearly this is a fundamentally important scene. And she's right. I'll often, like, a book will come together like it's baubles on a charm bracelet, but there's big strands of darkness between them, and like, I want to get there, and I want to get there, and I can kind of see a path there, but it really is, in order to kind of make sure that the work is cohesive, you've got to sort of find your way to get there. And so it's like, I know you want to get to that scene, Craig, but the way that you've got there, you're not you're testing the reader's threshold of belief on that. So you've really got to sort of figure out a way to do that properly. And that's a great deal of what I can't speak to what other writers go through when they work with their editors, but for me, there's a lot of that. And so some of those quotes, as though you mentioned, are kind of like the boxing metaphor is you're kind of softening up the body for the pressure they're going to face and the punishment they're going to face downstream.
Yeah. I mean, as I read them, both that and the deep and other things, I mean, it's the sense of dread they create is like in the deep when he is going beneath the hatching, finally going deeper and deeper and deeper until he finally confronts the figmen. It's inspiring this sense of like, man, I really don't want to see, but I can't not look. I have to know, like, because if I can't, I mean, to me, at the human level, it seems like, man, if I don't have a category to interpret this, it'll break me, I mean, obviously the capacity to interpret something gives you some sort of power over it in that sense, right? But if I, and because these, ebb and in Little Heaven and Luke.
Yep.
Luke. Yeah, Luke. Couldn't remember Luke or Clayton. Yeah, Luke and this, you don't have the categories for this. All they have is some sort of terrible thing that's happened to them, but they don't have the framework for it. And so the incapacity, the not having a framework for interpretation is what also increases the dread. I mean, it increases the terrifying effect of it. And I think that to me is what's so effective you're
very right. Yeah, and it's classic, Lovecraft or the Eldritch, sort of the notion that there are things that will drive you mad simply by locking eyes with
the
them.
vision of the very incomprehensibility of them is its own terror. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and I mean we're hugely influenced, our generation of, by Lovecraft, and I mean certainly there are elements in that of the deep, and there's elements of that in Little Heaven, and it is so resonant, right? Because it is this sense of, well, you explained it absolutely perfectly, better than I can, because it's like, sometimes you work with these elements, but you feel them on a really sort of like a wire in the blood kind of a way.
Yeah.
But you can't really describe, you know it when you see it, when you're working with those elements, and how powerful they can be. But I think what you said there is a great way of kind of unwrapping the sort of more diagnostic effect of it, of how it really works, right? So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so I teach Bible, I teach Old and New Testament here at this university, and a big part of that is a kind of a subcurrent in a lot of biblical texts that I teach. There's this theme is actually present as well. It's an interesting theme that like Moses goes to the top of Mount Sinai and wants to see God's face, and God says, no one can see my face and live. And it's just like, it's a recurrent theme, like the incapacity of humans to be able to look upon the face of God. And I find it really so that when I read fiction, whether from Lovecraft to you, I see this. I mean, obviously it kind of calls out to me, as it were, in a different vein. But because there's something in it that I or the biblical text I feel like deeply resonate with. I mean, the incapacity of just sort of a mortal creature to behold sort of something outside the bounds of our own space and time, and it would be terrifying to go like the descent of God to Mount Sinai. The people are like, we don't want to go near. Like all they hear is like fire, cloud, trumpets, and they're like, no, we're not going near that.
No, it's like, one of the scariest scenes for, I think, my generation, and it is similar. I think it's like Indiana Jones when they open the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, that's the
and evidently that's angels or whatever it is. It's got the deities kind of. Oh, and this is what they do. They melt your faces off.
Right.
So to look at it, obviously in the more eldritch scale, it's more to drive you a certain kind of mad. Obviously Steven Spielberg went with the melting wax figures. So neither good. Neither good. Yeah.
And it's pretty Yeah, it's pretty tough. I've been trying to convey to my students that there are ways in which I have to be careful how I say it to my students here, but that there are ways in which the Bible is effectively a horror story that turns comedy in the classic sense through sort of the through the salvific acts of God who overturns the horrors of the world into kind of in kind of a Tolkienish sort of a eucatastrophe sense that that's something terrifying and terrible that happens that somehow turns everything out better than it could have been had it not been. Okay, well, I could feel like I could talk about that for a long time, but the another motif that it impressed upon me deeply is the fact that your villains, whether it's the Long Walker or the Father from Little Heaven or the elder gods, whatever they are in the deep, actually even Shelley a little bit is the boredom or the apathy or the sadness that sets upon them as they're about to or right after they've done the terrible thing to somebody, right? Whatever it is. They're tinkerers, or they are, that's the figmen, they're tinkerers, they're eternally curious, right? Or the Shelley just wants to see how things work, and the most, honestly, one of the most haunting things is when he's putting Kent under the water, because he keeps saying show me. He wants Ken Step to show him something. He thinks that it'll give him a peek behind the curtain, as it were. And then same deal with the Long Walker with Minerva, the game. You have to play the game, and but it's sad. He says, you won't show me anything I don't already know. Minerva says, like, well, then why play? He says, and he sighs. I mean, it's a sorrow, and he says, I have to. And then it's not clear whether it's narrator, or it's you speaking, whoever it says. We're all prisoners to our own nature. So I just talk about this theme, about this apathy or this boredom that
that's great. I think that's you ask these great questions too, and you've clearly isolated some really and I can think of each of those scenes having written them, and obviously I can't remember my exact headspace, but I think it goes back to the first question you asked, like, what scares you? And sometimes you're not really even sure what scares you, or why you keep cycling back to these things, but they clearly do. This notion of, I think it is terrifying to me that, like, a good, maybe, you try and think, well, where do these things come from, and what is it? Obviously is part of your own nature that kind of pushes those scenes, but where else maybe would the influence have come from? And I remember, like, have you ever seen True Romance, the Tarantino movie?
No,
maybe. Yeah, okay.
I'm teaching the theology in art class, and he's a Tarantino buff, and he would be so mad at me right now for saying
that. Well, it's a
a
Tony Scott movie, as he's the director. It's but Tarantino wrote it. So but there's a scene, I won't belabor it, but it's James Gandolfini, and he's there with Patricia Arquette, and he needs to get information out of her, and she's not going to give it. And very short scene, and it's Gandolfini at his most threatening best. And he starts talking about the people he's killed, ultimately, like, kind of obliquely. And I think he said something like, now I just do it to see the way their expressions change. You know what I mean? Like, he's got, like, to the idea that you get to a place of such apathy, and yet there's still an appetite. You can't kill, you eat yourself until there's nothing left but the appetite, and it's that's almost scary too, you would think, because you've got these, or maybe there's these creatures, Shelley even including as a human creature, that, like, their own nature is so hardwired and so blinded that it's almost quite pathetic and sad, because it's like you can't be anything but what you are. You have no room for growth, change, or and in a way that's terrifying, that again, that creatures like that exist, and you just think, please God, don't let me fall afoul of them, come under their radar, and recognizing that creatures like that people like that do exist in our world.
Yeah.
There's certainly a horror to that as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you ask a really wonderful question, and I sometimes struggle with those answers because it's like there's something churning away in the stew of my brains, obviously, that is a mixture of my own fears and history and influences. But there's not a distinct like, oh, I'm glad you asked that, Paul, because
Yeah. I was appealing to this or whatever.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or I was very much, it was it was coming from this part of my brain,
sure.
Yeah. But that said, I'm glad you asked them, because these are not questions that I have faced before. And in the way of James Gandolfini, as somebody who talks about it's nice to actually, be asked something that I haven't had a chance to answer before.
Cool, good. Well, so I work in I've written some stuff on like intertextuality, so the way that one text is using another, and it's all and often though, one of my teachers said like, hey, you're using language, like I was saying like that, oh, this author is appealing to this text, or this author is doing XYZ. He's like, you don't know that, like you're reading the conscience of the author with that vocabulary. This might be intuitive for this author, and so that's really affected the way I've both written and read people. So now it feels odd to talk to you about you. But when I read your work, I was like, man, is this I mean, or is this intuitive for him, or is this sort of a conscious sort of expression of, I want to make sure this theme comes out, and I'm not going to make you answer that, but like I wondered with that, like, is this an intuitive sort of reaction to that sort of thing, like the notion of like, man, people are just, what if someone were this self-centered and whatever appetitive, had this much of an appetite or a curiosity that just is destructive, but anyway, yeah, that's kind of where like some of that came from.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I think, again, depending on how many authors you've spoken to, it's weird because, when I speak with other writers, it's much more quotidian, like, working writers. It's like, how did that deal go? Or, who's that editor? Or like, hey, did you send that person? Or like, me and Andrew Piper, who it's sort of like my wife will be like, you two are like the little rascals. You guys are always coming up with schemes, which is essentially like, let's do this together. Let's try and do that together. So it's interesting. We don't sit down and pick each other's brains generally about our work, it's but it is, obviously it's nice and validating to have someone who has, read as much and you're able to make these kind of links. And I do, I thematically, there are certain things. I think one thing that I am aware that I do, and I do strive towards doing consciously, is I like, a lot of the endings in my books, I think, are quite bleak. And that's, a lot of readers have a problem with that. And I don't blame them. I'm not going to change that. Not only I don't have a time machine, but also because even if I did, I would keep them the way they were. But I think too, when I was first writing, I would notice that some reviewers would say things like, his focus on gore and physical violence takes away from some of the better angels of his nature. And it's like, well, that's you're focusing on that.
Exactly. Like it's almost muted in some books. It's almost muted in Little Heaven, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, comparatively, right? Like, I mean, I guess, and not even purposely, but I guess compared to like what, and certainly some of the stuff that I read back when I was in high school or whatever, I think I've always thought I'm working from a super elevated level of what the worst is. You know what I mean? My bookshelf is right over here, and I could show you some, sort of old books that I, so it's like any, in the Troop or the Deep or whatever, or even some of the Davidson stuff is considered, it is violent by standards that you would apply to character, but it's not on my own personal threshold level. I feel like it's actually pretty, not weak sauce, but in any case. But the bleakness is one that, like, I really like characters, Paul, who are like, they come to a realization that like, this is bad. and this is actually pretty hopeless, and we're probably going to die.
Right.
I don't want to quit. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Don't want to give up. And that's, to me, like one of those noble parts of human nature, I think, is that when we recognize that things are bleak and that things are not going to get better and things are not going to turn out the way that we hoped they were going to turn out, but we're going to, fight to the very last of us to kind of fight against that possibility. You know what I mean? And so I guess it's like, it's bleak if you're looking at if you're looking at the very end, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's, I don't really fight back because it's not worth it. You know what I mean? But,
Sure.
but I even to say I bristle is probably not even true, but I feel like I put things in those books where it's, where the bittersweet nobility of what those characters are trying to do and what it says about who we are at our
Yeah.
depth is kind of like, that's there, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I get it. People are coming to it from whatever place they're coming to it from, and with whatever expectations, which are fair. I guess you're allowed to come to a book with a certain hope anyway. And then
Sure.
if they're dashed, then you have a right to feel upset about that. But I sort of say, okay, I get that, but also, like, if you read it at a slightly different refraction, you
Yeah.
can see that these characters are always trying, and always, despite the odds, are always generally trying to prevail and prevail not only for themselves, but often for somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because it strikes me that you don't become a hero sort of by being tested, right? Testing is the moment, it's a revealing moment. It's not you have to have done the heroic things sort of every day leading up to the moment of testing, and then testing reveals, what's there, right? And that's what I find. I mean, you're right that it's bleak, but it's also bleak in like there's like a sort of a film negative of bleakness there. So yeah, I mean, like the ending of The Deep, is bleak. You've got obviously the exchange, which maybe we'll get time for in a minute, but like the exchange of, Luke stays down there and his kid inhabits him, and it's terrible, right? I mean, these godlike creatures, whatever they are, have gone back up, and they're going to wreak havoc up there, and he's lost his life, everything about his. And same with Micah. I mean, Micah, the story with Micah, man, is the most gut-wrenching thing. I feel like it's gotta be like a top 5 most gut-wrenching things you possibly read, right? We're also like, okay, but it's also, look what he did for his daughter. Like, look what he did look what he gave himself up. I mean, it's okay, bleak, because of when you sit and imagine like the fact that there's this guy just suspended in the box, like that's bleak. But you're also like, look what he did for his daughter. Look what the life that his daughter now has because of that. I mean, like that's not bleak. Like that's kind of a shining example of like what humans might be able to like, reach for,
Yeah. I think you think too as a parent as well. I mean, thank God we never have those moments, like the house is on fire and you've got to run in
Sure.
there, you've got to, save your child, but the fire is going to swell before you can get out and it consumes you. I mean, thank God we never have those, most of what parenting is, as I know you recognize, and most parents, it's like everyday kind of like,
Be ready for that.
yeah, you know what I mean? It's just you're doing small little things, hopefully every day, to sort of help your offspring, But one of the great parts of fiction, I suppose, is to have these opportunities to write for characters, these kind of operatic moments where, where the entirety of the sum of what you are to this other person has to sort of culminate in this one moment of self-sacrifice. However, and you're right, it's Mika, but it's the other ones too. There's a great deal of sacrifices, big and small, in that book, and at least as I tried to write it, right? I mean, how it's going to land is going to really depend on all sorts of different readers and what they bring to it and what they take out of it. But anyways, you make a good point, but I do honor the idea that they are bleak.
For sure, and they are. I mean, like, no erasing that. I mean, it's you're like, oof, that was rough.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's I'm
I
not trying to
know.
erase that
Yeah,
at all.
yeah. And yeah, I don't be God bless my editors, and I don't know what they really think about, I don't really know what the math that editors do or publishers do when they start thinking how this book is going to do or how they can seed it into the market or what the reaction is going to be, and it's not that we haven't had back and forth about different aspects of the book, but I've never ever been told, Craig, can't you just
Right.
paint a smiley face
Sure.
on the end and
Sure.
because people are going to have a real issue with that. And it's never been that.
Yeah.
I've never ever once been told, sort of like, let's put a sunny last 50 pages on where everyone's happy.
Yeah. 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 Well, no, kudos to your editors. I think it was smart. So I mean, okay, so I'll move to the next one. Just
Sure.
when I was talking about the curiosity thing, sort of the tinkerer thing, you mentioned appetite, but that's something that I'd actually also, um, you know, there's this line from I think it's Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf says, he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom, right? So this is Sauron. That's Sauron's mistake, right? All he's done, he just wants to find out what the ring can get him, and your villains often follow that path of, we can, so we will. And you've already kind of spoken to this. I mean, you get this in the Deep with their testing and the Long Walker, but also the Breach with the thing is pure appetite, right? The thing is just pure hunger, and all it wants is food all the time, so he must constantly feed it, right? And of course, that's literalized in the troop, right? But yeah, that to me again is just, it was so effective in functioning as sort of an allegory or a type of just these beings who are not just destructive of themselves, but destructive of the others around them, because they're only feeding their curiosity, right? They're only feeding this destructive appetite, right? But yeah. Well, you've spoken to that. If you have, I'll move on. I wanted to read this passage because it's one of my favorite passages.
Sure.
It's from Little Heaven as well. It's the Long Walker talking to Pet. Says, vivisection. Is this word familiar to you? And she says, no. Oh, yes, sometimes it's the only way. And he's picking up the knife and toying with it. It says, to know something, to truly know that thing, you must open that thing up. And then the man sees what's happening, so he's starting to feel afraid. And says, the Long Walker says, the only way to understand anything is to see what makes it tick. Tick, tick, tick. To see how those things fit together, yes, to expose the soft and delicate parts. But she said, and Petty responds, but you already know how they fit together. He says, yes, each is subtly different, my pet. And it's these subtleties that intrigue. And it goes on. So that's, it's an amazing passage because you're obviously the description of the figure itself as sort of taunting this guy, the fear that he's feeling is really palpable. So we've already kind of covered sort of the curiosity component. But the same passage has the kind of a good segue into the next question, because I think it's maybe the most haunting image from your books for me. And so it says that she could see that it was excited for what was to come. Its skin jumped with anticipation. Yet, mixed in with that excitement was a strain of deep tiredness, as if it had done this exact thing so often that the act had long ago surrendered any enjoyment. To me, that's pretty devastating. It spoke to me to how often humans, particularly, I think of addictions, right? The thing that people will return to an addiction, and it's surrendered its original enjoyment, but it's captivated the person in the worst sense of the word, and they can't escape him. But it says, seeing this, Petty felt a weird pity. Wretchedly, the man asked, "Am I in hell?" And this is the spot where I'll ask you to reflect on this. The Long Walker responds, "Hell is a box. Yes, it is. Hell is a box not much bigger than your body. It's dark inside the box and cold, but the encasement is thin. So thin you can almost convince yourself that you can break out if you only tried. You can't feel anything inside this box, but you can hear. Outside of it is everyone you loved. ... So I'll let readers go back to that, but it's the basic point is that you're hearing your loved ones outside this box and you can't get to them. So kind of both aspects of this, of course, like the notion that confinement, Robbie, so that's sort of a literalization of that, but also honestly at the social level, it's like isolation. I mean, like
Yes.
as dependent creatures who depend upon each other for love and joy and actually just health. Hell would be being in a box, right? You add to that the emotion of like, not being able to reach out to your loved ones. I mean, like, what is it behind this? I mean, I'll ask you to basically speak to that basic issue of like the dread that's kind of.
Well, because you haven't read Handyman, but when you do, you'll see that I've obsessionally returned to that specific image, and it's like some of these things are just like a beacon that just sort of, a lighthouse beacon that goes around and is dark, and then it shines, and you just, sort of it's this kind of subliminal obsessional pulse that keeps coming back. And I mean, that specific image, I remember writing that, and I remember going back to it. And like a lot of these things, Paul, in this case, it came from like, I don't remember my dreams very often. I'm not sure about you. I guess as we get older, we just simply don't. It's like I'll go into my son's room and he'll have had a really vivid dream, or he'll come into our room and not even a bad one. He'll want to describe, and he'll remember the intricacies of this dream, even though I can tell it's fading, and as he gets older it's going to do more so. But like for me, that image, that feeling was a dream that I had once, where I was encased in like rock, I guess it felt like, and I couldn't move, and I could like a mountainside. Yeah, terrible. Well, the worst part was like there were things outside of it was like felt like a mountainside or a giant block of granite that was like enormously big, and you couldn't even spot the outlines of it, so like the black rock. And I couldn't move, but there were things around me that could, and they had no good intentions to me. So that very much that feeling of helplessness, of immobility, and of feeling that like there is nothing that you can do to help yourself, and that there are malevolent entities nearby who have no care for you, your body, your psyche. I think I do right. I don't know what it is. I think maybe it is, I ascribe it to in the deep, like the idea, like there are entities in this continuum that are careless, and that they like literally lack the ability to feel care.
Pitiless, as you said.
Pitiless, yeah. They have no, it's just not in their phylum of understanding. It's like we can't grasp it because it has no part in our consciousness or ability. It's like a complete blank spot in our emotional registers. So again, some of it too, you have to talk at the very beginning of like where our phobias lie, and how we kind of go back to them. And I think more so than the Davidson books, the Cutter books are definitely formed by my influences, but also formed by like these kind of ungrippable fears, phobias that I guess I've been fortunate to have, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
One of the only, my wife will wake up and she's like, "Oh, I had a horrible nightmare." And I'm like, "I wish you could have given that to me, because I might be able to made us, a rent payment or, mortgage payment on that." Like, nice. You know what I mean? I can actually make hay with nightmares.
I can do some of that. Yeah.
And she'll, okay, well, tell me it. And it's like, I guess I have to have been there, because it's not, it's not scaring me necessarily. So yeah, and I know, this is for university class, and there might have been some hope, but I'm sorry to have dashed it, that like some of it comes from a maybe more intellectualized level, or a more sort of like a place of greater kind of conscious awareness of
No,
where I
not at all. Yeah, yeah.
am.
I know what you
Yeah,
mean.
it's more like I try and harness these things that ephemerally kind of surf through me and through my brain,
Sure.
and obviously do scare me.
Yeah,
But obviously you can't do them all together.
sure.
You can't, it'd be overkill, and it would be foolish. But generally each book tries to take something that is kind of a core fear of mine and sort of examine that at different levels with
Yeah.
different, sort of gradients with but anyways, yes, I know that exact, and they're actually doing like a like a limited of Little Heaven by Earthling, which is a great American small press publisher. And the great things with these limiteds is they do illustrations, right? So you get to see what the artist, like what he or she chooses to sort of
Yeah.
focus on and what sort of triggers them. And of course in Little Heaven there's a lot of the monsters in the woods. The guy absolutely like
Yeah.
incredibly good at doing that, but he did Hell is a Box too.
Oh my gosh. Oh
Which,
man.
yeah, right. Like, and it
That's
took me a second,
incredible.
like, oh God, that's where he went. So in any case, you were affected by that. It seems like, and
Oh,
this artist was as well. It's weird, for me, I can never tell what's gonna hit, right? I mean, in each book there are certain scenes that people clearly, they've been out for a while, they're like, oh, that's clearly a scene that assaults people. And the turtle scene in the Truth
yeah.
was one that, but often, like, I'm not sure when I'm writing it, I'm never like, oh, all right, this is one that's gonna absolutely
Sure. Yeah. Like here's
tear
the
my
here's
house
the big
down.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
It's so bizarre to me. And speaking of, in the reviews, I kept seeing the trigger warnings or content warnings for the turtle scene. And I mean, I love animals. I don't like animal violence or anything. But I just remember thinking like, it's so interesting that was the thing that was like,
totally, Paul. I was like,
I was
absolutely.
like, what are you guys? What book did we read in the same book? Like,
Kids are getting murdered all over the place. That's what I thought. Like, the book is going to come out. Even, to be frank, like when I sent that to my agent or I thought, no way is this going to get published. Like, but at least by like a big five. It's just too. But I was like, it's because kids are dying, and people aren't going to
right.
put up with that. Evidently, people have no real compunction about kids dying, but
Yeah.
a total, and I'm the same.
And
Like,
again,
I absolutely love animals, abhor animal violence, and in a certain way, it's like, those scenes are, they were hard to write. They were hard to write, and probably there's some of that in there. That whatever
yeah,
power those scenes have germinated for people, it's not because I was writing it sort of like gleefully or like that big
sure.
smile on my face or anything. And definitely the Cutter books do tend to gleefully go too far sometimes. I fully admit that, but not with scenes of that nature. Like, those aren't things I'm trying to do to kind of for me it was more like again, it's like they'll talk about the turtle scene, and again, I'm sounding defensive, and I don't mean to be, because I don't
That's fine.
ultimately, I don't really care,
I
and
can be, yeah, yeah.
people can feel whatever they want, but like the point that the scene afterwards where the eggs were hatching and they saved the turtles, to me that felt like, okay, here's the catharsis. Here's the thing that they
Yeah,
did. They feel awful about it. They were driven to it because they're forced to accept, or forced to kind of deal with these issues that are way above their pay grade and age level. But despite the fact, and while they're sitting there feeling terrible about having done that, they have an opportunity to actually in some way atone for what they did.
right. That, but also then going to the realistic level of like they're close to starve. I mean, they're not quite starving yet, but I
Yeah.
mean, I'm like they would have had every justification in eating the baby turtles or whatever. I mean, like they're actually hungry and they're but of course they don't. I mean, like that's so yeah, it's a redemptive cathartic moment, but I mean, yeah, it's very very odd to me. I mean, because yeah, I mean, people, if you haven't read it, but I mean, there's like Shelley putting Kent under the water or all that sort of stuff. I mean, that's the most gripping, honestly. Like I I had a list of questions here about that. I mean, like but that is probably the most arresting scene to
For
me.
you.
Or I mean, yeah, I mean, kind of a top five. I mean, I could probably pick about five super arresting scenes from that text. Also, I mean, I stopped pretty hard in my tracks with Kent's dad, thinking about who wouldn't have done what I tried to do, that sort of thing. But it's a very arresting in a different sense. It's very arresting in the sense of like, yeah, as a dad, I got a 4-year-old son. Like, yeah, probably nothing I wouldn't have done that to save my kid.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and that was
but
written like, yeah, again, when just when our son was born, a lot of at least it was being edited, and a lot of that is second draft type stuff where I'm adding things to try and flesh out the characters a little bit more.
yeah.
So
Greg,
you're right,
I
yeah,
had to stop reading the deep. I had
with
to
some
stop
of the dad stuff.
at the dad stuff with. I mean, I obviously resumed it, but by stop, I mean I had to like set it down and
Sure, yeah,
uh with the dad at the park. I had at the time I had a 9-month-old, and it just like, I mean, it was it was tough. I mean, I was like, it was easily the most arresting moment, and had to stop. And because, I mean, it confronts you with, like, it could happen, obviously not the monster component, but just like the paranoia and setting of like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, you look away for 2 minutes and who knows what can happen, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And you're
Just
like,
like,
I'm a scatterbrained human being. I'm, half in my own head half the time. And it's like, yes, but we've had a child, and like, you have to account for your own sort of
yeah,
failings, you know what I mean? And you're right, your entire life can change. And obviously your child's life can change from a moment of inaction, a moment of like a lot of great books and movies and in that moment. That's another thing I'm fascinated about, that moment of choice. You said it before, you alluded to it earlier. We really aren't sure who we are until you're tested, and you're in that crucible. And most
yeah,
of us never find ourselves in a kind of an operatic kind of crucible like that, as
right, right, right.
in fiction. You're in a whole bunch of different little crucibles daily or whatever, where you can lose esteem or you can lose your
Yeah,
grip on things. But yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised. And I've certainly had, I mean, that was a hard scene to write, and I've certainly had scenes in other books where in the same way, you have to put it down. You really, or it really kind of
yeah,
like grips you in a way specifically to your own circumstances as a human being.
yeah, yeah. So I've just now noticed the time. I want to respect it. I've got tons more questions, but I want to. I
Or
don't want to.
they've been great. Why don't you like one more, and then because
Okay.
I don't want to bore you. So you've been
No,
great.
no, you're not boring me. Okay. Goodness, I don't know what to do here. I'm gonna do.
Just don't ask me what I'm working on next.
Hey,
That's
do
how
you
it really
know?
was.
Hey, did you know? Having watched a bunch of interviews, I I was telling my brother, who I got to read your books and he loves them, and we were talking about, I was like, he's like, so you got your questions ready? I was like, I know the one question I'm not asking you is, that
Yeah.
plus, you're right, and like writing craft stuff. I'm not asking what he's doing next, and about social media. Why are you on social media? Like, it's the opposite. Like, why is anyone on social media is the better question. like
I think it's,
that's a hard job.
I'm sure you've had like, I think social media, it really honestly is great. It's like, it's to everyone's own personal taste. I could imagine that you've probably had lots of great conversations based on social media, I mean, maybe as many bad ones though. Maybe it's
No, no,
kind of,
no. It's been good. I learned a lot. I mean, well, because for me, I use it for like book recommendations, basically. So it's good, yeah. But yeah, no, I was like, here's the two I'm gonna ask. Social. I'm not gonna ask him why he's not social. I'm not gonna ask him about what he's writing next. Because who cares? I mean, like, obviously he cares and I care, but he wants people who write want to talk about what interests them. So
well,
anyway,
also there's a certain level of like say if I did like, oh, Paul, I'm glad you asked. I'm writing about this clown who goes to space and has all sorts of wacky adventures, and you'd be like, oh, well, that sounds great. I'll be looking forward to that. I don't put you in a
okay.
position of like, oh, well, you want to write something different, maybe, Craig?
That's good. All right, man, I've got too many here. It's tough to pick. Let's see. I'm gonna ask you a one actually substantive one and one just sort of like an easy sort of
Okay,
just like
cool.
a yes or no type. Um, so all right. The recurrent motif again throughout your books is that of like debt or owing something. So Saturday Night Ghost Club, Jake's father is talking about the obligation these parents have to love their kids unconditionally. Kids don't owe you anything back, you know, that sort of thing. The deep, obviously, it's in Luke's loss of his kid. Like, hey, this is on me. I owe this kid. You know, Micah owes Pet. Interestingly, in each of these cases, I mean, it's the protagonist who feels the debt toward the obligation to love. Sorry, you froze for a second, so I want to make sure you're there. Okay.
Yeah, am I back? You back?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're back. Yep.
Okay, yeah.
So each of these, right, you've got a positive debt, right? Parents owe their kids love. Micah owes this to Pet.
Yeah.
Luke owes this to his kid Zachary. Interestingly, kind of the obverse, the villains, they feel they are owed.
Yeah, like Flesher.
Amos Flesher says, I did what he said. Now he owes me, you know, that sort of thing, right? Yeah. And actually the long walker in the game with Minerva says like, you owe. And she says, what do I owe? Right. And everything. The game decides. Everything or nothing, the game decides,
yeah,
you know.
Yeah.
And he's also, I mean, again, I don't know. This is sort of how deep this was at an intuitive level. I didn't look up the riddle. I tried to solve it. The pairs of letters consecutively, I have 3. I take it right as that's the riddle.
Listen, I'm guessing. I'm not sure where I got that from. I didn't conjure it up myself. So
yeah. No, I figured you didn't conjure it up yourself, but I'm assuming it's the word bookkeeper.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Right, which is like a counter of debts, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's a counter of debts.
Geez, yeah, exactly. Again, I wrote that. I guess it came out in 2017, so I was writing it 2015. It's interesting for me to go back and try and find where I was in each of those scenes. But overall, even Shelley, you could think like he thinks he thinks the universe owes him sort of a glimpse of Clayton could I wouldn't say Clayton is necessarily a villain, but I could see as though he feels like an entitlement kind of. And whereas the heroes definitely feel like have a heightened sense of guilt and a heightened sense of feeling that they are bad, even though, and so I think very much you hit something, especially with the protagonists, is like, I think one thing that I ascribe goodness to in a character is that they struggle to feel good. I mean, it's either the redemptive of trying to atone for past ills, which, sort of the characters say in Little Heaven would be archetypal of that. But even the ones who haven't done anything, and this would even go to some of the characters in the books under my own name, it's they very much struggle with a sense of some unexpiated guilt that if you actually unpack it and look at it, it's like you're not, like they don't really, it's almost like they maybe in some sort of a quasi-religious way, they burden themselves with guilt that they do not owe anybody to. No, but she feels it keenly as though it was, and there are personality types that you notice that will take on a freight of guilt and they become interesting as characters because that guilt riddles them and pushes them in directions that they might not otherwise go, and asks things of them and warps them in ways that is unhealthy. But also it's like there's maybe some kind of, mental imbalance that makes them feel like they're unworthy of whatever good outcomes that the world might have for them. And
Yeah.
as such, they're kind of on this collision course with, some awful fate that they don't really deserve, right? And I don't know where that came from, where that comes from. Again, I don't know. And maybe if I saw a therapist or unpacked my own psyche a bit better, it probably does boil down to something in some way that dogs me at a much, much more distant level than, the sense that am I being a good dad? Am I being a good husband? And if I'm not, then whatever misfortunes I suffer, maybe it's because, the universe has this very intricate way of squaring its scales on an right down to the granular individual basis. You know what I mean? And that's probably a very religious sense. Your sins are being toted up against you in some sort of
Right.
large ledger in the sky. And some people feel like that they are inexorably, it's impossible ever to square them because the things that they have done have been so enormous that no amount of goodness or self-sacrifice will amend their evils.
Yeah. Well, I also noticed that it's the good characters like Micah and Luke who are very willing to exchange, and is this great combo with Minerva where he says, "I owe." And she's like, "What do you owe?" She's like, "I owe everything." And it's so, I mean, he and Amos are both thinking in terms of obligation or debt, and yet it's Micah who's thinking in terms of I owe myself,
Yeah.
and Amos who's thinking I am owed, after he'd done a monstrous thing, right?
Yeah.
And it's this, I mean, and not just that, but it's to me, I mean, what struck me was that it's the long walker and the father or whatever's going on there is the one so interested in extracting at the granular level. I mean, it's the long walker who says, like, I'm the bookkeeper and I'm gonna get my debt, like I'm gonna get it back because you owe me, right? I mean, it's but the protagonist, when the debt language comes in, it's in terms of like, I'm doing this because, to me, I mean, that's just my reading, right? Because I owe this to out of love. I mean, I love my kids. This is what I owe them. I'm giving it back. So, I mean, to me, like, it would be easy to reduce the debt language to a granular thing, but I'm also like, no, I really owe my kid. I really owe him. He is owed love for me and care for me. And when he's, extracting it from me, he's not being, miserly or granulating. I mean, like, I really owe him. Like, I brought him into this world. I love him. I care for him. Like, this is what and so there's like this, and anyway, that to me was a really interesting dynamic that I thought was particularly gripping. I mean, and good writing like yours, it presents sort of a challenge to readers, is what it does. Or I mean, whether you intend it or not, right? I mean, it presents sort of like it puts a stake in the ground. It's like, hey, where are you on this? Like that sort of thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Paul. I really do, and I think you're very right. And these things do matter to me because I think if you're going to write the way that I do too, like with being as visceral, I think as and again, that's an aesthetic choice that I make, fully consciously knowing where I'm going with that. But I think that there is I do my best to counterbalance that with the sort of things that you're talking about, like real care for the characters, a real sense of again these emotional sort of contextualizations and shadings that I'm not even, again, fully aware of. You know, a character sort of comes together over the course of a novel, right? Like I don't start out knowing exactly who Mika is. Mika becomes who he becomes, or Luke, or Max, or, you know, Uncle Calvin, and there is a germ, a kernel of an idea of the rough shadings of who this person is, but sort of how they evolve. And I imagine this is the same with most writers. I don't know, but they come to live through the experiences that you put them through, which, you know, sometimes you know that ahead of time what those experiences are. Sometimes, you know, they come to you the day before, and you wake up with a new trajectory that you're going on than you were, you know, when you set your head down on the pillow to go to bed. So like they evolve and they change and they diversify, and like that has always been my main objective, I think, more so than the plot stuff or some of the individual scenes. It's really ideal, and it doesn't always work. You know, some people will say, you know, these characters don't live for me on the page, and that's always a risk you take, and that's just always sort of, either you harmonize with a reader or you don't, right? On all sorts of levels, aesthetically and otherwise. But the attempt, more than anything with any of the books, starts from a level of the character. So I think a lot of things that you are making note of, and I really appreciate it, you know, have to do with that, the evolution that those characters go from the moment when I start writing about them and thinking about them to when I say goodbye to them at the end. And they are different. They are different entities by the time, you know, clichédly we go on that journey. You know,
Sure.
I learn more about them, and they become more, they take on more depth, and they take on more of me and more of the people that I know too.
Yeah. Craig, thanks for this chance to talk with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Paul. I really do. I thank you very much. Those were some really thoughtful, as I said, very different questions. So I was really pleased to do this, and thank you very much for reading and for the support.
Yeah, of course. No, this was fun. You've what's unique about your writing, both to me personally, is the horrific elements are truly horrific. And I love a lot of writers out there in the horror genre. So, you know, no, this isn't sort of like a knock or anything, but you're a unique talent, and your writing is just, it really does, I mean, it really does grip a person and really arrests both their attention and assaults their senses. And so, I mean, that's what kind of grasped me from your own writing. So I'm really grateful for both just the care and attention and effort you've put into both writing and producing your Cutter and your Davidson stuff, all of it. I mean, it's honestly, it's been a gift. It's been a gift. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, Bob. Let me know. Send me your address, and once we got these final copies of Handyman in, I'll send you a copy hot off.
I really appreciate that. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's a gift. I'll do that. Well, great. Well, listeners, we're gonna sign off. Lots of great work for you to, I assume if you're listening to this, you're already aware of Davidson and Cutter's work. And if you haven't read all the stuff, then you know where to get his stuff. Little Heaven, The Deep, The Troop, Acolyte, and all his Davidson work that I mentioned, you can find it. And Handyman Method coming out. So something to look forward to. That's big time. Thanks a lot, Craig. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Take care, Paul.
All right. Bye.